Good evening. I'm Kathryn Smith, General Director of Madison Opera. Thank you for joining me for a preview of our upcoming production of Giacomo Puccini's La Bohème. I'll start by talking about Puccini's life and career and then delve into the opera itself. When I'm done with my presentation, we'll go to your questions. If you are watching this on October 16th, please type your questions into the YouTube conversation box. You can type them while I'm talking, and then I'll see them when I get to the Q&A. If you're watching this after October 16th and have questions, feel free to email me at info@madisonopera.org. Now I'll ask the magic people to share my screen. Giacomo Antonio Domenico Michele Secondo Maria Puccini was born on December 22nd, 1858 in Lucca, Tuscany. He was one of 7 children and came from what might be called a Lucca musical dynasty. His great-great-grandfather was the Maestro di Cappella of the Cathedral of San Martino. This position was then held by his great-grandfather, then his grandfather, and then his father. They all composed church music, naturally. His grandfather also composed several operas, and his father composed one. Puccini was 6 years old when his father died, and he entered the family business as a church choir boy. His first major composition was a mass written when he was 21 years old. The Queen of Italy then gave him a grant to study at the Milan Conservatory. For his thesis there, he wrote an orchestral piece that got good reviews, starting his reputation as a young composer to watch. After that success, Puccini's teacher suggested he write an opera and introduced him to a young librettist named Ferdinando Fontana. Their first work was called La Ville and told about a young man who inherits wealth and runs off to the city, leaving behind his girlfriend, who dies of grief and is turned into a ghost who haunts young men. They wrote La Ville for a competition of one-act operas. It did not win, which one scholar attributes to the score being illegible, but supporters funded a production and it premiered in Milan in 1884. One critic wrote after the premiere, "Puccini could be the composer for whom Italy has been waiting a long time." The performance was enough of a success that the publishing house Casa Ricordi purchased the opera. Revised into 2 acts, La Ville was performed at La Scala in 1885. Puccini was now 27 years old. Giulio Ricordi, head of Casa Ricordi, was arguably the most important non-musician in the Italian opera world during his lifetime. He had been Verdi's publisher, and by the late 1880s was actively looking for a young composer to be the next great opera composer. It was perhaps the greatest luck of Puccini's life that Ricordi took him on at an early age, steering him through his career and functioning very much as an agent might today. Ricordi commissioned a second opera from Puccini and Fontana, Edgar, a love triangle between a tenor, soprano, and mezzo. It premiered at La Scala in 1889 to a lukewarm response and was withdrawn after its 3rd performance. Puccini rewrote it several times, but it never became a hit. Without the support of Giulio Ricordi, Edgar might have been the end of Puccini's career. His personal life was becoming scandalous. He had just run off with a married woman, and Ricordi's board of directors suggested they drop him, as he had yet to make the company any money. Giulio Ricordi insisted they continue to fund Puccini while he was writing his next opera. For his part, Puccini blamed Edgar's failure on the libretto, and as a result became extremely picky about his libretti, requiring many revisions in structure and text. Unsurprisingly, his relationships with his librettists were challenging, and Ricordi often had to intervene to prevent them from quitting. For his 3rd opera, Puccini declared he would write his own libretto so that no fool of a librettist could spoil it. Ricordi disagreed and found him a bunch of librettists. Puccini went through each of them as he kept changing his mind. Ultimately, his next opera would be written by 7 different librettists, 2 of whom are the most important. These were Luigi Illica and Giuseppe Giacosa. Giacosa was a lawyer turned playwright, considered Italy's leading playwright at the turn of the century. Illica was also a successful playwright, although less so. The 2 men would ultimately write the libretti for Puccini's most famous operas. In broad terms, Illica wrote an opera's plot, while Giacosa wrote the lyrics. Their first collaboration with Puccini, the one with 7 total librettists, was Manon Lescaut, which premiered in Turin in 1893. Based on a French novel about a young woman and her aristocratic lover, Manon had been turned into a very successful opera by French composer Jules Massenet only 9 years earlier. The stakes were high for Puccini. One more flop, and that could have been the end of the support from Ricordi. Fortunately, Manon Lescaut was a hit. After the London premiere, George Bernard Shaw wrote, "Puccini looks to me more like the air of Verdi than any of his rivals." Note, however, that the opera ends in the desert outside of New Orleans. None of the 7 librettists knew their geography. Some of Manon Lescaut's success was due to Giulio Ricordi's business savvy. He controlled the rights to Verdi's final opera, Falstaff, which premiered the same month, and insisted that any theater that wanted to perform Falstaff would also have to perform Manon Lescaut. Time for a pet photo. I like to scatter pet photos into my talks on the theory that everyone's lives are improved by looking at cute animals. The ones I'll show tonight reside with some of our company members. So first meet Kinga, who lives with Emily Fons, Madison Opera's new advancement officer, which means that Kinga sometimes hangs out in our offices. So, Puccini's personal life. While working on his first opera, the 25-year-old Puccini began an affair with one of his students, a married woman named Elvira Gemignani. She became pregnant by Puccini a couple years later and gave birth to their son in 1886. Shortly afterwards, Elvira, their son, and her daughter by her husband moved in with Puccini. But Elvira remained married to her first husband until his death 17 years later. A few years after his son was born, Puccini and his family moved to Torre del Lago, a small community in Tuscany near where he had grown up. He would eventually build a villa on the lake there, and it became his favorite place. He said, "I love hunting, I love cars, and for these things, in the isolation of Torre del Lago, I keep the faith." He lived there for the next 30 years until industrial pollution forced him to move to another village in Tuscany. So back to work. With Illica and Giacosa as his librettists, Puccini went on to write his 3 most successful operas, which premiered in 4-year intervals. First, La Bohème, which premiered in Turin in 1896. We'll talk more about it in a moment, but know that it was a massive popular hit. A year after it premiered, a critic wrote, "Puccini is undoubtedly the most fully equipped of the younger Italian composers, and his future career will be watched with some interest." Puccini was now 38 years old. Then came Tosca, which premiered in Rome in 1900. Based on a play about a singer caught up in Napoleonic politics and involving a murder, an execution, and a suicide, Tosca was a scandalous success. Then Madama Butterfly, which premiered at La Scala in 1904. Based on a play about a young Japanese woman abandoned by an American naval officer, it had a disastrous premiere, blamed on both lack of rehearsal and a hostile audience. Puccini then revised it, and the new successful version premiered 3 years later. After Butterfly, Puccini paused. Now in his late 40s, he had been in a bad car accident in 1903 and was also diagnosed with diabetes around this time. One of his librettists, Giuseppe Giacosa, died in 1906. And his personal life was not exactly going well. His relationship with Elvira was troubled by infidelity, to put it very mildly. Puccini had constant affairs, both long-lasting and short, often with the leading ladies of his operas. He claimed, "I am a mighty hunter of wildfowl, opera librettos, and attractive women." There was an immense scandal in 1909 when Elvira publicly accused their maid Doria Manfredi of having an affair with Puccini. The girl died by suicide. An autopsy revealed she had died a virgin, and Elvira was prosecuted for slander and sentenced to prison. Puccini made a financial settlement to the Manfredi family instead. Almost a century later, in 2007, documents appeared showing that evidently Puccini had been having an affair with Doria's cousin Giulia, who later gave birth to a son by Puccini. This resulted in a court battle over Puccini's estate in 2008. Back to work again. His next opera was La Fanciulla del West, The Girl of the Golden West, based on a play about a saloon owner, an outlaw, and a sheriff in a California mining town. A commission from the Metropolitan Opera, it premiered there in 1910. Despite the cowboy hats, it is as authentically American as Madama Butterfly is authentically Japanese. Then came a period of transition for Puccini. Giulio Ricordi died in 1912, and Puccini's relations with Giulio's son Tito were not good. Early in 1913, Puccini wrote to his wife, "I have no libretto, I have no work, my publisher is my enemy." Later that year, a theater in Vienna offered him a commission to write an operetta. Over the next few years, this turned into an opera about a courtesan called La Rondine. During the writing process, though, the First World War began, with Italy entering the war in May 1915. Puccini was not remotely politically active, which caused problems. He liked Austria, Italy's enemy. He disliked France, Italy's ally, and he did not particularly care about Europe overall. He was strongly criticized for not signing a protest against the German bombardment of France and for not contributing to a book compiled in support of Belgium. His main concern throughout was for his son Antonio, who had enlisted in the Italian army. His close friendship with conductor Arturo Toscanini stopped for years as a result of all of this. During their fight, Puccini forgot to strike Toscanini off his Christmas panettone list. He wired to Toscanini, "Panettone sent by mistake, Puccini." Toscanini wired back, "Panettone eaten by mistake, Toscanini." After the war, the two men repaired their friendship. So as I said, La Rondine had been commissioned by a theater in Vienna, but that was now an enemy capital, so it premiered in 1917 in Monte Carlo, which was politically neutral. A year later, his next work premiered at the Metropolitan Opera, the three one-act operas known as Il Trittico, or the Triptych. These three operas have not a single thing in common. Il Tabarro is a love triangle set in the canals of Paris. Suor Angelica is about a nun who was forced by her family to give up her child, and Johnny Skiki is a comedy involving a dead body and a will. Meet Ham, Swiss, and Rye, who live with Scott Gendel, our principal coach and accompanist, and also the composer of Madison Opera's winter opera, Everlasting Fate. Go get your tickets to that one too. So politics again. The extent of Puccini's involvement with the rising fascist movement is not clear. In 1919, the mayor of Rome asked him to write the Hymn to Rome, honoring Italy's victories in World War I. After Puccini's death, the Fascist Party used it as one of their anthems. The Fascist Party itself came to full power in 1922 and made Puccini an honorary member, but it does not seem that he was ever an active member. He met with Mussolini twice, seeking government support for a theater he wanted to build. Puccini was diagnosed with throat cancer towards the end of 1923 and went to Brussels for radiation treatment. He died from complications that led to a heart attack on November 29, 1924. He was 65 years old. His first funeral was in Brussels. 2 days later, Toscanini led the Scala Orchestra at his funeral in Milan. He was initially buried in the Toscanini family tomb. Once a chapel had been built inside the Puccini villa at Torre del Lago, his remains were moved there. But there was one final opera left unfinished, Turandot, about an ancient Chinese princess and her attempts to avoid marriage. Puccini had written all but the final 15 minutes when he died, and another composer completed it from his sketches. The unfinished version premiered on April 25, 1926. Franco Alfano's completed version premiered the following evening. Puccini's operas are now among the most performed in the world, as was true during his lifetime. But here's the thing. For all his success, Puccini doesn't get much respect. One writer points out that impresarios, musicians, and singers have taken to this music from the first, while academicians have kept explaining how terrible it was. One book quotes the following possibly apocryphal conversation between composers Benjamin Britten and Dmitri Shostakovich. Shostakovich: "What do you think of Puccini?" Britten: "I think his operas are dreadful." Shostakovich: "No, Ben, you're wrong. He wrote marvelous operas, but dreadful music." However, Puccini was writing for the public, not for other composers. And the fact that his estate was worth $250 million when he died indicates his level of success. Conductor Thomas Beecham once said, "If an opera cannot be played by an organ grinder, it's not going to achieve immortality." Puccini's music can be played by organ grinders, and it is arguably immortal. I will close talking about Puccini with a brief home movie, displayed by our video dog, of Puccini playing the piano, taken around the year 1900. This was, of course, filmed silently, and someone edited in what they think he is playing. Now let's talk about La Bohème. First, the story of the opera. We are in the Latin Quarter of Paris in the 1830s. 4 friends live together in a garret: the poet Rodolfo, the painter Marcello, the musician Schaunard, and the philosopher Colline. The opera starts with them tricking their landlord to avoid paying the rent before heading out to celebrate Christmas Eve. Rodolfo stays behind to finish some writing. A knock on the door brings Mimi, a neighbor who says that her candle has blown out. Rodolfo relights it, then Mimi realizes she has lost her apartment key. As the two search for it, both candles are blown out. Rodolfo takes Mimi's hand and tells her about himself. This is Charles Castronovo at the Metropolitan Opera. Mimi then tells Rodolfo about her quiet life alone embroidering flowers. This is Anita Hartig at the Met. Having met only 15 minutes earlier, Mimi and Rodolfo declare their undying love and head out into the Paris night. This is Charles Castronovo and Anita Hartig. The scene changes to the streets of the Latin Quarter as customers and vendors mingle. Rodolfo buys Mimi a bonnet and introduces her to his friends at Café Momus. Musetta, Marcello's ex-lover, enters with a wealthy older man, Alcindoro. Spotting Marcello, she gets his attention by bragging to the crowd about her popularity. This is Aida Garifalina at the Vienna State Opera. Musetta finds a pretext to get rid of Alcindoro and falls into Marcello's arms. The act ends with everyone happily following a Christmas Eve procession. The next act takes place on the outskirts of Paris a couple months later. Mimi arrives looking for Marcello, who is staying at a tavern with Musetta. She tells Marcello of her distress over Rodolfo's incessant jealousy. Rodolfo comes outside and Mimi hides. Rodolfo tells Marcello that he wants to break up with Mimi, but then admits that Mimi is dying and he thinks that her illness will only get worse in his garret. Mimi overhears this and comes forward to say goodbye to Rodolfo. This is Federico Lombardi at the Met. Rodolfo recalls their happiness together, and while the two of them reminisce, Marcello and Musetta fight. Mimi and Rodolfo then decide to remain together until spring. Months later, Rodolfo and Marcello, now separated from their girlfriends, lament their loneliness. This is Teodor Ilnekai and Gabriel Viviani at Covent Garden. Colline and Chenard bring some food, which the friends pretend is a banquet, and start a dance that turns into a mock duel. Musetta bursts in, saying that Mimi is outside, too weak to climb the stairs. Rodolfo brings Mimi inside, and the others find excuses to leave. Left alone, Mimi and Rodolfo recall their happiness together. The others return, and Mimi drifts into unconsciousness and then into death. Meet Fig Newton and Sprout, who live with Alex Taylor, who is singing the dual role of Benoit and Alcindoro in our production. So, how did we get here? As with all of Puccini's operas, La Bohème was not an original story. It is based on Scènes de la vie de Bohème, Scenes from Bohemian Life, a collection of short stories and vignettes by Henri Murger. Louis-Henri Murger was the son of German immigrants to France. He left school at age 15 and worked a series of menial jobs while writing poetry. He also wrote for whoever would pay him. He once said he turned out prose at the rate of 80 francs an acre. He edited a fashion newspaper as well as one for the millinery trade. He lived in a Paris attic, and his circle of friends called themselves the water drinkers because they were too poor to afford wine. He started writing stories for the literary magazine Le Corsaire Satin when he was 23. Many were semi-autobiographical, featuring characters based on people he knew. The first story was published in March 1845. The third, a year later, bore the subtitle Scènes de la Bohème, or Scenes from Bohemia. He published 18 more stories in the next 3 years, all with that subtitle. Although the literary community liked the stories, they did not reach a wide audience. But in 1849, playwright Théodore Barrière approached Murger about writing a play based on the stories. The result, La Vie de Bohème, featured songs as well as drama and was a hit, credited to both men. Murger was suddenly famous and wealthy at age 27. He wrote, "I dreamed I was the Emperor of Morocco and had married the Bank of France." The play is not discussed much now, but it is strongly related to the opera, as it focused on the relationship between Rodolfo and Mimi, ending in her death, whereas the vignettes are about a lot of different people. In the play, Mimi does not leave Rodolfo because she is ill, but because she is persuaded to do so by Rodolfo's wealthy uncle. In the opera Bohème, there is a passing reference to Rodolfo's wealthy uncle in the Café Momus scene. And if this sounds vaguely like Verdi's La Traviata, just know that that opera's source material was published 1 year before Murger's play was written. The success of the play created a new demand for Murger's stories, so he compiled most of them into a collection, added some new material, and published the result in 1851 to acclaim. He published the sequel the next same year, Scènes de la vie de jeunesse, or Scenes from Youthful Life. More works followed, but none brought him the same acclaim, and he lived the rest of his brief life in bad health amid financial problems. He received the Légion d'honneur in 1858, but within a few years was lying penniless in a Paris hospital. He died in 1861 at age 38. His dying words were reported to be, "No more music, no more conflicts, no more Bohemia." The French government paid for his funeral, and hundreds of people contributed to a fund to build a monument to him. And I have to share this quote from him. "The first duty of wine is to be red." So let's take a look at the world of Murger's Scènes de la vie de Bohème. First, the phrase La vie bohème, or Bohemian life. In broad terms, it was a movement in the 19th century of people, mostly men, who deliberately led an unconventional life involving artistic or literary pursuits. They held anti-establishment views and were usually poor, although sometimes that was a voluntary poverty. The Café Momus was a real place located on Paris's right bank. In this drawing from 1849, you can see Café Momus on the right-hand side. In La Bohème, the café is moved to the left bank of Paris. Rodolfo, the poet, was of course based on Murger himself. In the opera, he writes for a periodical called The Beaver, as did Murger. Marcello, the painter, was a composite of two actual painters, Marcel Lazare and Tabar. The latter spent a lot of time on a painting of the crossing of the Red Sea, which is then reflected in the stories and in the opera. Colline was a composite of two philosophers, Marc Trapedoux and Jean Malone, the latter a compulsive book collector whose coat was always stuffed with books. This was a running gag in the Murger stories and is reflected more solemnly in the opera by Colline selling his coat. Schaunard was based on Alexandre Cham, a painter and musician who was Murger's roommate at one point. Mimi, as we know the character, is two separate women in Murger's stories, one named Francine and one named Mimi. They were in turn based on four of Murger's ex-girlfriends, including one who died young. Musetta was based partly on Marie-Christine Roux, an artist model, and partly on a Madame Dupont, who married a poet. And a bit of medical history here. In Murger's stories, several young people, including Mimi, die of consumption, as the disease killed a number of his friends in real life. We now call consumption tuberculosis. It is an infectious bacterial disease spread through the air. It was an epidemic in 18th and 19th century Europe. In 1815, for example, 1 in 4 deaths in England was due to consumption. The vaccine was invented in 1921 and went into widespread use after World War II. Yay, science. Meet Reggie and Cosmo, who live with Emily Secor, who sings Musetta in our production. So, Murger died in 1861. 30 or so years later, we get to La Bohème the opera, or rather La Bohème the opera's plural, because things get a tad confusing. It is winter 1892. Composer Ruggero Leoncavallo, a contemporary of Puccini, had just had a massive success with the opera Pagliacci. The two men were friends, but not really, as the question of who would be the most successful composer was a long way from settled. At this point, both men were 35 years old, and both had written one hit opera. That winter, Leoncavallo started writing an opera based on Murger to be called La Bohème. Around the same time, Puccini declared he was writing a La Bohème as well. He evidently had also considered writing an opera based on the life of Buddha, but gave up that idea. Leoncavallo was not happy about this, and in March 1893 wrote in a newspaper that he had already claimed this subject and that Puccini knew this perfectly well and was copying him. Puccini's response was printed in a different newspaper. If Maestro Leoncavallo had told me earlier what he told me unexpectedly the other evening, I would not have thought of composing La Bohème. Now it is too late for me to be as courteous as I would like towards him as a friend and musician. Let him compose and I will compose. The audience will decide. However, Leoncavallo had written his own libretto for Bohème over a year earlier, and at that time had even offered it to Puccini, who had turned it down. What further complicates all of this is that both Leoncavallo and Puccini were basing their operas on the play La Vie de Bohème, but the play was not in the public domain, meaning they would have to pay royalties. The stories, on the other hand, could be used for free. The only downside is that when Giulio Ricordi, Puccini's publisher, attempted to get exclusive rights to the stories for Puccini, he could not do so. So both Leoncavallo and Puccini wrote operatic versions of Bohème. Leoncavallo's version, with a tenor Marcello and a baritone Rodolfo, would premiere in 1897, a year after Puccini's version. It was the less successful of the two, although still considered quite good. So Puccini now had a subject, possibly ripped off from another composer, and it was time to write. Libretto first, using Giuseppe Giacosa and Luigi Illica, who had written Manon Lescaut, a newly minted success. By June 1893, Illica had completed a prose scenario for Giacosa to put into verse. At this point, there were 4 acts and 5 scenes. Most of the middle of the opera, as we know it now, the Café Momus scene and the one outside of Paris, are original, with only passing references to incidents in Murger. Most of Acts 1 and 4, the scenes in the garret, followed the vignettes, or really the play. Giacosa wrote to Illica after receiving the first draft of the scenario, "I have read it and I admire you. You have been able to extract dramatic action from a novel that to me always seemed exquisite, but little suited to dramatization." Giacosa turned the scenario into verse over the summer, and Ricordi announced in print that the libretto was ready to be set to music. That was a trifle over-ambitious, as Puccini never used the first draft of anything. And indeed, he demanded plenty of changes. Given how tightly written Bohème now seems, it is remarkable how slowly the writing process went and how much changed. Some changes were simple, the adding of Mimi and Rodolfo's Act 1 love duet. But others were more dramatic. At one point, Illica wanted to eliminate the Café Momus scene, which Puccini refused. Then Puccini wanted to eliminate the scene outside of Paris, which Illica refused. Sometimes Puccini asked for things and then wanted them cut, such as a drinking song or a diatribe against women written for Schaunard to sing. To say Illica was frustrated with the constant changes is an understatement. He wrote to Ricordi in January 1894, "There is no man more impossible to satisfy than one who enjoys making others work so he can get out of working himself." For a while, a big point of contention was that Puccini did not want Rodolfo and Mimi to break up at all. February 1894, Illica to Ricordi. "He wants to start the last scene with Mimi in bed and Rodolfo writing. That means Rodolfo and Mimi have never been separated. Well, then we no longer have La Bohème. We have a meeting in an attic apartment between a journalist, poet, and a dressmaker. They fall in love, they argue, and then the dressmaker dies. It is a pitiful story, but it is not La Bohème." An entire act was cut, whose only interest now is to explain something that remains. In Act 3 of Bohème, as we know it, Rodolfo refers to Mimi flirting with a viscount. There was originally an act before that involving a party Musetta hosts, during which Mimi does dance with a viscount. While his librettists were writing and rewriting, Puccini started looking at composing a completely different opera, based on the Sicilian novella La Lupa. He even traveled to Sicily to visit the author in spring 1894. On the way back, a fellow passenger convinced him that such a violent story would not make a good opera. That passenger was, rather randomly, the daughter of Cosima Wagner, widow of composer Richard Wagner. Puccini's librettists were not thrilled to discover that he was considering dropping their work after they had spent a full year on it, and Illica told Ricordi that he was quitting. Eventually, Ricordi managed to get the project back on track. So in my opinion, the hero of La Bohème is Giulio Ricordi. Finally, in summer 1894, Puccini started composition. Sort of. Instead of working on Bohème, he wanted to spend his summer on his boat. Elvira wasn't happy about this, so Puccini hired a young man to arrive at the house before she got up, lock himself in the study, and then play some music repeatedly and slowly as if he was composing, while Puccini himself was out on the lake. Elvira was happy, Puccini was happy, and I'm sure the fishing was lovely. And the writing continued. August 1894, Illica to Ricordi. It is Sunday, 12:15, and my eyes are wet. Mimi has just died, and the poor Bohemians are weeping, gathered in silence around her corpse. 5 months later, Illica to Ricordi. Bohème is, you might say, finished, and what is more, the Doge is satisfied with it. The Doge was his nickname for Puccini, referring to the medieval heads of Italian city-states, and it was not a compliment. And yet Puccini was not satisfied, and the opera was definitely still not finished. As 1895 dragged on, so did the rewriting. Giacosa to Ricordi in June. I'm tired to death of this constant remaking, retouching, adding, correcting, cutting, piecing together, extending on the one hand and reducing on the other. I've written this damn libretto from beginning to end 3 times, and certain sections 4 and 5 times. I swear to you, I shall never again permit myself to be caught with the writing of a libretto. The opera was finally finished in December 1895, 2.5 years after it had been started. Meet Lily and Jax, who live with stage manager Alyssa Pond Franklin. The premiere of La Bohème was scheduled for the Teatro Regio in Turin, where Manon Lescaut had premiered 3 years earlier. Puccini wanted an all-star cast for his opera, but Ricordi objected on both artistic and financial grounds, writing, "There was a time when everything depended on the virtuosity of the throat. For Sonnambula and Norma, one had to have specialists. Today, opera needs a homogeneous cast, the more intelligent the better. It is not the artist who is responsible for the success of the opera, but the opera itself." He also warned Puccini of practical matters, to be careful of plunging opera into bankruptcy with excessive demands. Let us not force the impresarios towards expenditures which are impossible. La Bohème went into rehearsal in January 1895. This was the cast. Cesira Ferrani sang Mimi. The 32-year-old soprano had sung the title role in the premiere of Manon Lescaut 3 years earlier, and her career continued for the next decade. She came out of retirement at age 65 to sing the small role of Kate Pinkerton in the first ever recording of Madama Butterfly. Evan Gorga was 28 years old when he sang Rodolfo, and he retired only 6 years later. He became a major collector of art and artifacts, by some accounts collecting over 150,000 different pieces. In 1949, at age 84, he gave around 40,000 artifacts to the state of Italy, which are now on display in Rome. In return, the government paid his debts and gave him an allowance until he died in 1957. Camilla Pazzini sang Musetta. The 21-year-old soprano came from a musical family, and both of her sisters were opera singers. Tieste Wilmot sang Marcello. The Italian baritone was 37 years old. Among his other notable roles was Alberic in Italy's first performance of Siegfried. Colline was sung by Michele Mazzara. I can find nothing about him, and this is not a photo of him. Antonio Pini Corsi sang Schaunard. The 37-year-old baritone had sung Ford in the world premiere of Verdi's Falstaff a few years earlier. His career continued around the world, including performing with the Metropolitan Opera for a decade. Alessandro Polanini sang the dual role of Benoit and Alcindoro. The 52-year-old Italian bass had created a small role in Manon Lescaut, as well as one in Verdi's La Forza del Destino. The conductor was a 28-year-old named Arturo Toscanini. He had become a conductor almost by chance, when as a 19-year-old cellist, he wound up conducting an Aida performance when the conductor walked out. While gaining conducting experience, he continued to play cello, for example, playing in the world premiere of Verdi's Otello at age 20. Puccini wanted a more famous name to conduct the first Bohème, but Giulio Ricordi insisted on this young conductor, who would become the most famous conductor in the world over the next 50 years. I also want to mention the designer of the premiere. Adolfo Hohenstein was a German painter and illustrator. His main fame is as a poster designer, and you may recognize his style. Earlier in my presentation, all of those original Puccini posters were by him. But he also designed sets and costumes for a number of operas, and I've been showing you some of his work throughout this talk. Here are some of his designs for the La Bohème props. And now into rehearsals. During the process, Puccini wrote to his wife that the soprano singing Mimi was good and Musetta was excellent, but he wrote of the Rodolfo and Marcello, "The first hasn't got such a bad voice, but I doubt whether he will last. The baritone is full of goodwill, but a terrible actor." One book notes that Evan Gorga sang the role of Rodolfo largely transposed down. La Bohème opened on February 1st, 1896. In the audience were members of the Italian royal family, as well as a number of composers. The audience was moderately receptive, but Puccini recalled years later, "Even that night, between acts, in the corridors and backstage, I heard whispering around me. Poor Puccini, this time he's on the wrong track. This is an opera that won't survive long." The reviews were dismissive. La Bohème, even as it leaves little impression on the minds of the audience, will leave no great trace upon the history of our lyric theater. Another writer, "We wonder what could have started Puccini towards the degradation of this Bohème." Another review called Bohème a failure, written in haste, so it appears, and with little discernment and polish, often lapsing into the empty and sometimes the puerile. The reviews were basically condemning two things. First was the choice of subject matter. Poor artists who have no regular jobs, cheat their landlord, and sleep around without being married. Mimi, in particular, was criticized for being so immoral, thanks to the double standard. Some reviews basically referred to her as a prostitute. Second was the fact that the music was so emotional, which critics derided as manipulative. Another factor might have been that Wagner's Götterdämmerung had received its Italian premiere in the same theater only 6 weeks earlier, and the contrast between the two works was stark. Meet Guy Noir, Private Eye, and Kit Kat, who both live with Clay Thompson, who sings Colline in our production. Giulio Ricordi was calm about the reviews, writing to Illica, "All this merely confirms my belief that La Bohème is a new and daring work of art, and therefore much argued about and little understood, that is, by the intellectuals, who can never be truly unbiased, while the public is moved and delighted." He was right. From the beginning, Bohème was a hit with audiences. The initial production ran for 24 sold-out performances, and then the opera spread swiftly. Puccini made a few small changes, such as adding lines in Act 2 where Mimi shows off her bonnet. The opera's rapid spread around the world was helped by the Ricordi Company's massive promotion of the work, with shops selling La Bohème postcards and memorabilia. The first performance outside Europe was in Buenos Aires in June 1896, 4 months after the premiere. By the following year, it had been performed in Egypt, Russia, Portugal, Brazil, and Mexico. Interestingly, many of La Bohème's local premieres were in a city's second theater, for example, at the Paris Opera Comique, rather than at the Paris Opera, at Vienna's Theater an der Wien, rather than at the Imperial Opera. In some countries, it premiered in a non-major city. Its Russian premiere was in Moscow, not St. Petersburg, and was staged by the Moscow Private Opera, not by the Bolshoi. The same was true in England. London's Royal Opera had had a flop with Manon Lescaut and weren't interested in Bohème. So instead, the English premiere was in Manchester, an industrial city with a good art scene. Puccini went to England to supervise along with Tito Ricordi. Neither man spoke English, the language in which Bohème was to be performed in Manchester. While the show was in rehearsals, a newspaper described the two of them. I never saw two young men in a more despondent frame of mind or more certain of failure. But Bohème was not a failure in Manchester. A review said, "We have not often recorded so successful a first performance. At the end of every act, there were ringing cheers from all parts of the house." Puccini hated England's climate, by the way, calling it a land of black smoke, darkness, cold, rain, cotton, and fog. The American premiere came in October 1897 in Los Angeles by a touring company of no particular distinction, who then toured it to New York the next spring. The Metropolitan Opera's first performances were part of their winter 1900 tour, performed in San Francisco, LA, Denver, Kansas City, and Minneapolis. A San Francisco review called Bohème a brilliant, vivid, scintillating sort of thing. It represents the last word so far of the modern Italian school. A Los Angeles review noted that a crowd had gathered in the alley behind the theater to listen to the music, with the strong implication that those outside were the working class, often immigrants. The audience inside the theater was appreciative, but the audience that heard the music was more so. During the singing, there was not a stir. Everybody stood breathless, spellbound. The Met performed Bohème in New York that December. The New York Tribune. La Bohème is foul in subject and fulminant but futile in its music. Sometimes for a moment it is the vehicle of passionate expression, but more often it is the vehicle of noise. The New York Times was kinder, but thought it all rather trite, comparing the plot to La Traviata and other older operas. In the score, we find ourselves on very familiar ground. There is an abundance of melody, and there are many twistings of rhythm and harmonic disjointings, but we have heard them all before. A little digression. At this point in the early 1900s, Mimi was often sung by the famous Australian soprano Nellie Melba, and she would do a sort of encore after the final curtain by singing the mad scene from Donizetti's Lucia di Lammermoor. Because on the one hand, why not? But another theory is that this was sort of to provide a soothing bit of standard repertoire for audiences who were leery of modern music like La Bohème. Critics never really eased up on La Bohème, even after it became a success. In 1920, a French critic predicted that in 10 years, nothing will remain of these works but gramophone records and the exhalations of barrel organs. These works were specifically La Bohème, Tosca, and Cavalleria Rusticana. A decade later, Gramophone magazine's editor-in-chief wrote, "It is improbable that a century hence anybody will be moved by Traviata or by Bohème." Audiences disagreed with those critics, and Bohème remained standard repertoire around the world, performed pretty much everywhere all the time. This is a list of countries that are performing Bohème this season, and I won't claim that it's complete. In the early days of records, singles were released of the most famous arias. The complete opera was first released in 1917, followed by a succession of recordings, including a performance conducted by Toscanini in 1946, 50 years after he had conducted the world premiere. When television came along, Bohème went there, such as an English-language version performed by the Met in 1953. More films and television broadcasts followed. Bohème was also made into a number of silent films, some of which claimed to be based on Murger, but that was largely to avoid paying royalties, because remember, Puccini was still alive during the silent film era. The Bohème films continued once talkies came along, and some started integrating Puccini's music, such as these from Austria, Italy, and South Africa. The most famous adaptation of Bohème by far is, of course, Rent by Jonathan Larson. It opened on Broadway in 1996, a century after Puccini's opera premiered. Set in the present-day East Village, it had clear parallels to its predecessor and became an absolute sensation, much like the original Bohème had been. This is Melody, who lives with studio artist Alexandra Birch, who is covering the role of Musetta in our production. So this will be Madison Opera's sixth production of La Bohème in our 65-year history. Our first was in 1963 and was the first full opera we ever performed in the auditorium of Madison's East High School. We performed it again in 1984, in 2000, in 2007, in 2015, and now in 2025. And this is our cast. Mimi is sung by Renee Richardson, who debuted with us at Opera in the Park last summer. She has sung with Houston Grand Opera and Wolf Trap Opera, among others. Rodolfo is sung by Terence Chin Loy in his debut with us. He has sung with the Metropolitan Opera, Lyric Opera, and the Royal Danish Opera, among others. Musetta is sung by Emily Secor. Emily was a Madison Opera studio artist for 2 seasons, and most recently sang Diana in Orpheus in the Underworld with us. Marcello is sung by Kyle White in his debut with us. Kyle has sung with Wolf Trap Opera and Santa Fe Opera, among others. Colline is sung by William Clay Thompson in his debut with us. Clay has sung with the Metropolitan Opera, Lyric Opera of Chicago, and Wolf Trap Opera, among others. Chonard is sung by Lee Fondang, a current studio artist who sang Mazzetto in Don Giovanni with us last season. And the dual role of Benoit and Alcindoro is sung by Alex Taylor, who was with us last fall as Basilio in The Barber of Seville. And our wonderful Madison Opera Chorus is joined by the amazing Madison Youth Choirs. The production is directed by Alison Pogorelch in her debut with us and conducted by John Demain with the Madison Symphony Orchestra. Our sets and costumes are traditional and come from New Orleans Opera and Utah Opera, respectively. And a last dual pet photo. It was pointed out that most of our artists seem to have 2 pets and an awful lot of cats involved in La Bohème this year. So meet Stella Marie and Olive Theodore, who live with Renee Richardson, who sings Mimi in our production. And before we go to questions, a final video. As I said, La Bohème was part of the earliest days of television, which often included live performances. So this is from a 1956 NBC broadcast called Producer's Showcase, and features Renata Tebaldi and Jussi Björling, the first time the former appeared on TV. This is the very end of Bo Soave Fanciulla.
Dammi il braccio, mia piccina, obbedisco, Signor, che m'ami di, io
So now let's go to questions. If you're watching this on October 16th, please type your questions into the YouTube conversation box so I can see this. And if you're watching afterwards, feel free to email me at info@madisonopera.org. So I do have a question that was sent in advance, actually by a cast member, and I won't say who just asked me who my favorite Bohemian is. And I will actually do have an answer. It's Chonard. One of the things, I didn't go into the full plot, Chonard's entrance aria explains how he killed a parrot in order to get a job over with. And I just think he is sort of the funnest of the Bohemians. Question here. Is the role of Benoit and Alcindoro always played by the same person? It was certainly written to be played that way and is almost always played by the same person. Vocally, it's that way. Certainly there's time for the change. I'm sure of the million productions of Bohème that have happened over the last 130-something years, there have been some that split it, but it is certainly written to be done by the same person. Good question. Being that Puccini often took his themes, hi Marge, from novellas or short stories, did he ever get sued for using the themes? Copyright was looser then. So no, I mean, he got into a little trouble. Like when he wrote the first Manon, it was pointed out that someone had just written a hit Manon opera and what was he doing writing another, but he didn't get sued and he got away with it. The Bohème issue, again, it's based on in the public domain stories, but they were really clearly using the play, got away with it. You didn't ask this question, but I'm going to go there. One of the things I find highly entertaining about Puccini and Andrew Lloyd Webber. La Fanciulla del West. So the first time I saw La Fanciulla del West, his 1910 opera set, air quotes, in the American West, a big love melody came up, and I thought, I think I've heard that before, even though I'd never seen the opera. And I had. It was in Phantom of the Opera, like not just a few notes, but a whole thing. And it turned out that the Puccini estate sued Andrew Lloyd Webber successfully for ripping off, I think it was Music of the Night, but don't quote me, enough of Puccini's La Fanciulla del West that actually the royalties from Phantom of the Opera go to the Puccini estate. Not a question you asked, but there we are. Let's see, are there any other questions? I don't think so. Okay, so I will draw this preview to a close. Thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it distracted you for a little. If you're in the Madison area, I hope you come see La Bohème next month. But again, just have a great night. Thank you so much.